next up is fast cars. Our next speaker is Paul Ingrassia. Paul is an alumni of the University of Illinois from what is now the College of Media. He's also a Pulitzer Prize winner. He won it for beat reporting with his reporting partner Joseph B. White when they were both at the Wall Street Journal for his coverage of General Motors. Paul was the Detroit bureau chief for many years for the Wall Street Journal. He later ran the Dow Jones Newswires unit before leaving to write books again. His current book is Crash Course, and he'll be speaking about the Big Three in Detroit. I don't think Detroit needs much introduction and the difficulties of the Big Three, but for example, Detroit. I'll just throw off a few statistics off the top of my head that I have in mind. Detroit has the highest unemployment rate, crime rate, and auto insurance rate in the nation, which the last one I find particularly perverse considering their native industry. So without further ado then, Paul Ingrassia.
Thank you, Greg. I'm going to okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's really a delight for me to be back on campus during the summertime. Greg was very kind enough in the introduction to mention the Pulitzer Prize, which happened back in 1993 when I was in Detroit. And one of my sons, who was then in junior high at the Jesuit Academy in Detroit, went to school the next day and told his teacher that his dad had just won the Pulitzer Prize. He was right, is all I can say. I'm going to really begin by talking about some historic events that happened in 2008, 2009, and yes, here we are. Okay, it was an amazing, year between mid-2008, 2009. We had the bailout of banks, America's banks and Wall Street. We had the first African-American president elected. We had the bankruptcies of two of the largest and most iconic companies in America, General Motors and Chrysler. It was one historic breakthrough, i.e. the election of President Obama, but two historic breakdowns, what happened in Wall Street and in Detroit. We spent 7 or 8 times as much as a nation, us taxpayers, to bail out Wall Street and the banks as we spent to bail out the Detroit car companies. But I would argue, frankly, that the Detroit bailout was far more emotional to many Americans because of the place of cars, in our culture, in our history, and our economy. Automobiles really shaped America in many ways. I don't know how many of you had the chance or obligation, if you were in school, to read Cannery Row by John Steinbeck. He wrote that in 1945, but it described events in Monterey, California, at the turn of the last century, and he said, most babies of the period were conceived in Model T Fords. Not a few were born in them. He said some other things about cars, too, in that book. It's quite an interesting book. After World War II, suburbs began in America, Levittown out in Long Island. The first national motel chain sprung up in Tennessee, Holiday Inn. Fast food was really invented by Ray Kroc at McDonald's, or at least commercialized by Ray Kroc, and interstate highways sprung up. So all these revolved around the automobile, the whole landscape of America. And you might say that the American landscape was sort of shaped by the 4-H club, highways, housing, hamburgers, and hotels. And, and besides that, cars found their way into music and movies and that sort of thing. I'm going to date myself here, but, I graduated from the university in 1972. But when I was a teenager, the Beach Boys recorded a song called Shutdown, okay? Shutdown was not about a bank closing. It was about a drag race. 3 years later, Wilson Pickett had a hit song, Mustang Sally. It was not Mustang Sally Mae, okay? So there's a whole difference here between how automobiles and other institutions in our society really affected people. Now, in the book that I just published a couple months ago, I try to deal with the big questions. They're listed here on this slide, basically. One of the key things is why this happened. Was it inevitable? Was the bailout worth it to we, the taxpayers? And what are the broad lessons beyond the auto industry that we're going to learn from what happened? We hopefully can learn from what happened, and also what the shape of this business will look like for our country in the future. Why did it happen? Well, sort of simple, sort of complex, to be honest with you. The basic reason this happened is that we had for decades in this country, the auto industry consisted of a corporate oligopoly, the Big Three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, and a labor monopoly, the United Auto Workers Union, which organized the plants for all the car companies, all these 3 car companies in America. So every auto worker in America basically was unionized by the UAW. So this concentration of power, enormous, unchallenged economic power, was what caused decades of prosperity, but also it really, frankly, sowed the seeds of the industry's demise because it led to arrogance, complacency, inbreeding, and really ignoring the consumer in many ways. The attitude was whatever cost increases you have, just pass them through to the consumer. You know, they don't have any choice but to buy one of our cars unless they're willing to settle for some little German weirdo car, you know, called the Volkswagen Beetle, right? So that's what they did. I want to give you a brief history of the auto industry, very brief. In 1908, Henry Ford introduced a car called the Model T. He had a very specific vision for automotive transportation. It was the first people's car. The Model T Ford ended rural peasantry in America. People could afford it, and it was reliable. There's an apocryphal story about a social researcher of the day went out to an isolated rural homestead and talked to the woman who lived there and said, gee, you have a car out here in front of your cabin, but you don't even have running water in the place. You don't even have indoor plumbing. And she said, you know, you're right, but you can't go to town in a bathtub, okay? So it really revolutionized America in many ways. The 1920s, 20-some years later, another man came along, Alfred Sloan Jr., the chairman and CEO of General Motors. GM, until that point, had been an also-ran in the car business. But Sloan had a very radically different view of automotive transportation than Henry Ford. Henry Ford saw it as just getting from point A to point B. Physical transportation, physical mobility. Alfred Sloan visioned automobiles as vehicles for social mobility as well. What you drove would signal who you were, your status in society. He created this hierarchy of brands, Chevrolet all the way up to Cadillac. The 1930s and 40s come along, and the UAW organized the industry, and there were a series of violent strikes, and so all of a sudden you had this concentration of the UAW and the big 3 together. In the 50s and 60s were the glory years for the U.S. auto industry. The Corvette, the big tail fins on the Cadillacs in the mid to late 50s, the Ford Mustang, the muscle cars of the late 60s that, you know, really 300 or 400 horsepower cars. I used to, frankly, drive them when I was in college here. They were great. But it couldn't last. It was too good to last. And then came the 1970s. 1970s were a tough decade in this country. You know, we had Watergate, we had Vietnam, we had bell bottoms, you know, we had Donnie and Marie, all kinds of stuff, if you will. But in the auto industry, some very important things happened. What happened in the auto industry reflected this whole movement in society when everybody was talking about rights, which was fair enough, but nobody was talking about responsibilities anymore. In 1970, there was a landmark strike against General Motors. It lasted 67 days. The union won 30% wage increase over 3 years, but more important, it won 30 and out retirement. And at first, you could retire at the end of 30 years on the assembly line, full pension, full medical benefits for life. Now, at first, there was a minimum age of 58 years old to take advantage of this. Within a few years, the minimum age went away. And just think about this. You graduate from high school, age 18, you work for 30 years. At 48, you can retire, full pension and benefits. If you live till age 78, you can get full pension and benefits for longer than you worked. That was called social progress, but no one really saw what was going to be the result of all this. We had 2 oil crises in that decade, 1973, 1979. The Japanese first started getting customers in this country in that decade because the cars were fuel efficient. People found them also to be remarkably reliable. Detroit tried to counter with its own small cars, Vega, Gremlin, Pinto. Didn't work very well. And meanwhile, all kinds of work rules and job classifications were growing up in these very increasingly complex contracts between the company and the UAW. I mean, there were 200 or 300 different job classifications saying who can do what job and who can't do what job, and efficiency sort of went out the window. It was all about, you know, adjusting yourself to the contract. At the end of the 1970s, a little barely known car company, really the 8th largest car company in Japan named Honda Motor, came to Ohio. They did it because they did not see any room for them to grow in their home market. They looked in California, where Jerry Brown was the governor. They looked in Ohio to locate their factory, where Governor Jim Rhodes, sort of one of these Rotary Club Republican types, was the governor, and they chose Ohio for a whole variety of reasons. In 1979, they opened a motorcycle factory. It was sort of a test drive, if you will, because they weren't sure they could get along with American workers, but they quickly found that they could. November of 1982, they began car production in Ohio. So look at what's happened between the 70s and the early 1980s. Okay, that corporate oligopoly had disappeared because now a foreign company was building cars successfully in America. Also, it happened to be a non-union plant. Quite interesting what happened there. The Honda's headquarters in Japan directed the managers here on the ground to recognize the UAW. They wanted to be American. The bosses back in Tokyo wanted to be seen as another American company. The bosses on the ground here in Japan, though, in Ohio, though, had a different idea. They said, look, this is not working very well. There's a real confrontational attitude in the Detroit factories, and we can do it differently. We can do it better. Anyway, they put it to a vote. The workers voted the UAW down, and so the whole oligopoly monopoly thing really fell apart during the 80s. Then came the 80s and 90s. A remarkable turnaround at Chrysler under Lee Iacocca. They invented the minivan. Ford developed a car called the Taurus. It revolutionized automotive styling. General Motors launched Saturn with the idea of revolutionizing labor relations, okay? And it was a brand new contract, separate from the master UAW contract. A very inspiring memorandum of understanding between the union and the company. All people want to be involved in decisions that affect them, care about their jobs, and want to share in the success of their efforts. So unlike the master UAW contract, the pay at workers of Saturn was linked directly to Saturn's quality, productivity, and profits. Pretty revolutionary for a hidebound industry. On the other, the companies made record profits during this year, but they sort of wasted them, frankly, by a lot of diversification schemes. They also started something called the Jobs Bank, basically where if a worker was laid off because of a production cut or a technology implementation, they would be guaranteed 95% of their take-home pay. And initially it was like for a year or so they would get this money, and there was a cap. Within a few years, the Jobs Bank was extended, so you get 95% of your take-home pay indefinitely. And there was no cap on the amount of money that the companies had to spend to do this. It was really pretty remarkable. The result of all this, you had a round trip in the 80s and early 90s. You had record losses in the early 80s to record profits in the middle years of the decade, back to record losses again in the early 90s. And then came the miracle drug, okay? SUVs. The Japanese just didn't get it. They could never imagine that Americans would go out and spend premium dollars to buy huge gas-guzzling off-road vehicles and then never take them off-road, okay? It just wasn't logical. And they were right. It wasn't logical, but it's kind of what we do, okay? Meanwhile, Honda, despite being the pioneer here among the Japanese, was beset by this enormous bribery and kickback scandal in its own sales ranks. A guy named Jim Cardigis led this ring of people who were getting kickbacks from dealers in return for increasing their allocations of cars from the factory, so they'd have more cars to sell. Jim Cardigis was nicknamed Car Jesus by the Honda dealers because, if you put the right amount of money in the collection plate, all kinds of miracles would happen for you in getting more cars. Anyway, so the Japanese were really suffering, frankly, in the 1990s. In 1998, Germany's Daimler-Benz bought Chrysler, a huge price, $37 billion. 1999, Ford and GM earned $13.2 billion of combined profits, all from SUVs and big pickup trucks, that sort of thing. But sadly, during this time, the UAW and General Motors undermined Saturn, each for their own reasons. GM didn't feel it had enough money to invest in new models, so it let Saturn go an entire decade without a new model of car. The UAW, meanwhile, the hierarchy in Detroit was taken over by some reactionary people who viewed that innovative Saturn contract as a threat to UAW orthodoxy. And so systematically and against the wishes of a lot of the Saturn workers, frankly, down in Tennessee, They dismantled that contract and returned back to the master GM UAW contract. Another practice crept in then called inverse layoffs, and I just want to describe that for you in a quick minute. Inverse layoffs, well, in any industrial setting, layoffs are determined by seniority. So if you're senior and there's a cut in production, you stay on the job, the junior people take the layoff. But getting 95% of your salary indefinitely, or your wages indefinitely, while being laid off made it very attractive to be laid off. So the union won the right to have its senior workers invoke inverse layoff rights, which means they could bump themselves into unemployment, getting 95% of their take-home pay for not working indefinitely, and bump the junior guys back onto the assembly line. I don't know about all of you, but, you know, it sounded like a pretty good deal to me. And it did to them, too, because a lot of people took advantage of it. As a result of all this, these imbalances were growing up. The new millennium comes out, and, you know, the companies start losing money again. General Motors and Ford, Chrysler were making all their profits from SUVs and pickup trucks. They were like a one-legged stool. Small cars weren't in the picture. Then Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005. The winds blew all the way up to Detroit economically because gas prices soared. SUV sales took a nosedive. GM lost $10.6 billion in 2005, a record. The next year, Ford lost $12.6 billion. Now, these were not recession years in America. These were years of a booming economy and near-record car sales. So really, these problems that we saw in 2008, 2009 were really festering in the middle years of the last decade. 2008 was the fateful year, a milestone year for the auto industry in America. It was the 100th anniversary of the Model T Ford and also the 100th anniversary of the formation of General Motors. But Detroit was very vulnerable coming into this year because of its prior losses in the middle years of the decade. On the weekend of September 15th, a historic weekend, in the middle of a presidential election, Wall Street collapsed. Lehman Brothers was liquidated. Merrill Lynch was sold in a fire sale to Bank of America. Car sales collapsed too, about 40% overnight. No single other event in the history of this country, not the JFK assassination, not 9/11, caused such an immediate collapse in car sales. So these companies that were already fragile coming into this period now are literally going broke. They're running out of cash. In November and December of 2008, there were hearings down in Washington. The big three chiefs flew down to Washington, unfortunately and frankly stupidly, in their corporate jets to beg for a bailout. Congress rejected aid to Detroit anyway. But Bush found a way around it. President Bush gave some of that bank bailout money to Detroit as sort of he signed an executive order to do this. So what happened was, his attitude was, look, I just want to get out of town and leave this to Obama, okay? I don't want to deal with this issue. So then comes the bailout in 2009. I spend a lot of time in the book describing the sort of the machinations in the White House and the Treasury Department about the bailout. President Obama formed an automotive task force in February and March. On April 30th, they ushered Chrysler into Chapter 11. Fiat came out with owning 20% of Chrysler, even though this Italian company didn't pay a dime for Chrysler because it was the only company willing to put in new technology so Chrysler could get some new models. On June 1st, General Motors declared bankruptcy, an historic event. The U.S. government wound up with owning more than 62% of GM, a.k.a. government motors now. A lot of pain happened here. Dealers lost their franchises. Workers lost their jobs. Managers lost their jobs. Shareholders got wiped out. Bondholders mostly got wiped out. Bankruptcy is a bad thing, but there was no other choice at this point because the crushing load of debts, union contracts that were thick as phone books, a history of mismanagement at the executive level, all these things took a cumulative effect. As a matter of fact, one of the things that really helped General Motors collapse was not only its ineptitude in the car business by focusing on SUVs at the wrong time, but in the 2004 and 5 period, it decided it had to diversify its earning base. So what did it do? Subprime mortgages, okay? It worked great for about a year or two, but then the losses mounted into the billions, just as the car companies' losses were collapsing too. I want to deal with a few myths of this bailout if I can. One is that Detroit was a victim of the economic collapse. Not really true. Detroit was a victim of Detroit. Remember I said that in 2005 and 2006, record years for car sales, near records, good years for the economy. They were losing record billions of dollars. One of the other myths was that the secured creditors of Chrysler, the bond people who held Chrysler debts, were basically big banks on Wall Street and some pension funds, that they were wrong because the government didn't pay them 100 cents on the dollar for their secured debt. There was a lot of, angst about the death of the capital markets in America because, you could no longer count on secured debt being really secured. Really not true. Think of it this way. The only alternative besides the bailout of Chrysler by the government was liquidation of the company. In a liquidation, the banks that held secured debt would have gotten wiped out. As it was, they got 28 cents on the dollar. Not a bad deal considering 28 cents versus zero, okay? That's the way to look at it, not 28 versus 100. Another myth was that President Obama overstepped his bounds by insisting on the departure of Rick Wagner as the CEO of General Motors. Again, it's not true. Think of it this way. The government was providing debtor-in-possession financing to keep GM alive during a bankruptcy. Lawyers call it DIP financing, okay? In any situation, the banks that usually provide DIP financing always insist on calling the shots on management and strategy. Well, no bank was willing to come forward. The banker for General Motors, the banker of last resort, was the United States of America. So the head of the American government had every right to call the shots on management, which he did. Another myth of the bailout really was the UAW won by getting control of Chrysler. Again, not true. The fact of the matter is that the UAW wanted to be paid off for the debt that Chrysler owed to the UAW's healthcare trust fund in cash. They didn't want Chrysler stock. That was the last thing they wanted. Who knew how much this stock was going to be worth? But the president's task force was tough with the union, to its credit, as well as being tough with Wall Street. And I say this frankly, I'm a journalist, but I'm also a free market guy, and frankly, I'm a Republican, okay? Sorry to admit it, but I am. But these guys, the president did a good job on this, and his task force did a good job on this. They were tough and spread the pain all around. And I have to confess I was quite skeptical at first, but you have to maintain an open mind when you're looking into something like this. And these guys did a good job in spreading the pain and damping the effect on a potential catastrophic effect on the U.S. economy. The final myth is that Detroit's collapse was inevitable. Well, if that's the case, how do you explain the fact that Ford became the only U.S. company to avoid bankruptcy? It really was not inevitable. In fact, beginning in 2006, every time General Motors zigged in a major decision, Ford zagged. So GM insisted on keeping its CEO in place. Ford brought in a new CEO. In fact, Bill Ford Jr., who was the CEO of Ford Motor, basically fired himself. He went to the board and said, I'm not the guy to do this. We need to bring in somebody else, which they did. The next thing that happened was GM insisted on keeping all of its 8 brands, and it couldn't afford enough product development money to support the 8 brands. When the new CEO of Ford came in, Alan Mulally, they immediately started shedding brands. Jaguar, Land Rover, they just sold Volvo to the Chinese because they got the company down to a manageable size. So basically, General Motors and Ford took opposite turns at every step of the way in the last few years. Will this work? Boy, I hope so. I'm not sure. Chrysler's really struggling. The structure of this auto industry is going to be different from now on. We're not going to have a big 3 anymore. We're going to have a medium 6. It'll be Ford and GM, Toyota, Honda, maybe Nissan, I don't know, maybe even Fiat Chrysler, but I'm not so sure about that. Maybe Volkswagen, maybe Hyundai, but it's not going to be this big 3 oligopoly anymore. Those days are gone. It's really a story, I think, filled with lessons. I just want to tell you one little anecdote about this as I close. My son Charlie, the one that when he was in junior high school went to school and said, Dad won the Pulitzer Prize, he read this book right after Christmas, just before it was released to the public. So he calls me a few days later and he says, Dad, I read the book and I don't want this to come out the wrong way. I said, oh, okay. He said, yeah, but I really like the book. And I said, well, great, Charlie, I'm glad you did, but, why did you phrase it that way? And he said that, I grew up mostly in Detroit, but I could care less about the car business, and I could care less about cars themselves, frankly. But he said, this is really a book about human behavior and all the folly that can happen and how huge, great organizations can go astray, even though everyone sees, the car crash coming, but no one can muster the will to avoid the problems. It'll surprise none of you, by the way, that Charlie is a U of I law graduate, 2006, and now practices law up in Chicago. So anyway, I'm very proud to have one of my sons as an Illini. You've been a great audience. I appreciate it, and I hope to answer any questions if you have any. Thanks.